Today's challenge is going to be to swap out what's known as the upper control arms, which are actually on the bottom kind of, on this 2011 Mercedes GLK 350 4Matic, which will be a little different than the two-wheel drive version. We'll talk about that as we go, and I'll show you how to know you need to swap these out. Okay, here's your first visual clue that your control arms, and in this case, this is known as the upper control arm, compliance bushing. I think I've heard them called torque struts. There's lots of names, but in the Mercedes parts catalog, it's the upper control arm. Basically, this black stain here, that's not from engine oil or anything else leaking out. That's actually, this is a fluid-filled bushing in this control arm. And the bushing will eventually fail. It will start leaking this black oil from inside that will leave a trail. And when that happens, you start getting, it starts loosening up. And I don't know if I'll be able to, you can see it moving a little bit. I'm using a regular pry bar. It's really not too hard to move at all. I suspect the new one is going to be considerably tougher to move around than that. But you can see it's definitely got some movement there. So I'm going to be replacing both of these. The symptom that drove this swap was that there's just a tiniest little bit of shake in the front end, which is a symptom of something loose, and this is the first place to look on this suspension, and actually on a whole lot of other vehicles. And there are a whole lot of Mercedes vehicles that use the same arrangement, so this will apply to them as well, the C-Class primarily. And because of the location of the attachment for this control arm, and you can see this one's not really showing signs of leaking, but it's getting swapped out too. You do have to pull off both the front and the intermediate panels with the associated 8mm bolts. And in all likelihood, you will need a T40 and a 21mm wrench to get it the rest of the way, because of the fact that the shaft will spin when you turn the nut, so you'll never actually get the nut off the shaft. So this locks the shaft down and will come off like butter. And this is easier to do without a camera in the way, folks. Trust me, I make my jobs a lot more difficult than they need to be because of the camera intruding. But that's all right, it's worth it. And in this case, we're getting very fortunate because you can see that the control arm has already broken loose. So we don't really have to smack it, but if we did, it would be generally a matter of just hitting this surface here with a hammer. That will shock it loose, and that's important because this taper fit in here gets pretty tight, especially in a northern car that's had salt and rust and everything else going on in there, and these two surfaces get to like each other a whole lot, and they get difficult to get apart. Now I can get this one out easily enough once I release the other two, the other end of the control arm up here, which I now have access to because I dropped those two splash panels. So now I'm going to get my 21 on the inside nut here and break it loose with a hammer. Alrighty, the wrench is on. And I can tell you this one takes a little turning. For too long, you'll get to the point where the bolt is turning with the nut. So that's when you get out your E20 socket that looks like this and get on the head of the bolt and take it the rest of the way out. And this is the nut that comes off. Notice it's a jam nut design with these little castle extensions on top that are designed to jam up the nut so it doesn't come loose. There's a washer back there, so you may be able to just slide it out. You may need a little bit of a push from a tool of some sort. You can tap it out from the other side or pry it out from this side. It shouldn't be a big deal. Just work it out. And I would suggest putting the washer and the nut back on the bolt just to keep everything together so that you know what came out together. Also, a note on these bolts, there are some people who will advocate for replacing this each and every time you use it. This is a pretty heavy-duty bolt. I do not think it's necessary. That's my personal opinion. It's a steel bolt. It's not aluminum. It gets torqued down good and tight, but I don't think it's anywhere near its yield point. So as a result, I'm going to reuse that. You can get a new one if you want. It's probably 20, 30 bucks worth of hardware that you probably don't really need to buy. Once you're at this point, you actually should be able to rotate this control arm out of the way, around and out. Let's see, I believe it's going to take a little bit of turning the wheel back toward the left to get the clearance necessary. And I could force it out there. There it is. Okay, so that didn't put any undue stress on the axle. Unfortunately, we have to take this further. If you were putting in a non-Lemforder control arm, at this point you could fast forward through a whole lot of this video, and I'll show you why that is. Interestingly, folks, notice that there's just a little bit of a taper here on this ball joint body here on the end of the control arm. Whereas our new control arm, there it is square, and that's just enough to make this really more difficult. Just for what it's worth, you know. And I'm going to spin off the other control arm bolt nut with a breaker bar, followed by a ratchet. And luckily this one breaks free as well, but it's already spinning, so back to the wrench and T40 trick to get it the rest of the way out. Okay, and you can see how the control arm took a flyer up. That's because these are torqued down at ride height, not with the suspension drooping. So this is the position it wants to stay in. It's the spring action of this rubber bushing is twisting it back up into the position it wants to be in. Okay, so that's why whenever you set these, after you install them, you have to do it at ride height. We'll talk about that later, but for now, let's get this axle out of the way so we can get the new Lemforder control arm in. Okay, I'll take the E24 bolt out. By the way, you're going to have to put the wheels on the ground to loosen this one with a breaker bar, so get ready for that. So now the axle, this being an Arizona car, is loose, and I just have to get it out by fighting with the hub and pushing it out of the way, something that's probably not going to come through very well on video, unfortunately. Alright, with any luck, I'll be able to just lay this thing in more or less in the right position. And I can tell you that it's going to be a little bit fiddly. I'm going to go ahead and get the new nut, get ready to put on, and snug down just a little bit so that it will not pop out and take me back 10 steps. Okay, this control arm is going to be in the way, this axle is going to be in the way, but I can make it work because I go over the tie rods, folks. Go over the steering mechanism there, or you'll be regretting it. And I can see it's going to be helpful to align the ball joint shaft with the actual hole, depending on your entry angle. So now that's sticking out nice and far. And by the way, this nut has blue Loctite already applied. That's how they keep this on instead of using a jam nut. The other thing I can tell you is you need to run this one down far enough that it will that the CV axle's clamp for the boot doesn't run into the oversized ball joint body on the back of the Lemforder control arm. So, okay, we're getting that down nice and snug. That's fine. Now, all we have to do is we have our choice. We can either put it back together, what we've done, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and put the axle back in, and then I'll rotate it around and put the other, what's known as the lower control arm, although they're both pretty low, back in place. So again, don't force this. Make sure you're getting the axle into the splines, get it lined up. Don't pull on it, or you could damage the axle. Certainly don't pull the axle out trying to get it in place, because it will disconnect. It'll actually come apart internally, and you have to take it all back apart to get it put back together. Not the end of the world, but certainly a step you don't really need to do. Okay, sorry for the little bit of disappearance there, but what's happened is, in getting this thing all lined up, turning the suspension, turning the steering to get a better angle, inadvertently this control arm was up there. The forces, basically this nice sharp edge of this Lemforder control arm cut the boot on my lower control arm, which has now got to be replaced. So the good news is there'll be a forthcoming video on how to replace those as well. At any rate, I've got the new control arm nearly into place. It needs a little wiggling to get exactly where it needs to be, but I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the other control arm. I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the axle bolt just to bring everything a little bit closer together, and then I will do the fine adjustment to get the new bolt, the old bolt, back in the new control arm. Go ahead and snug this one down a little bit more. Okay, we should be pretty close on getting it lined up in the bolt hole up there. And well, you probably can't see it from that angle, but yeah, it's actually getting pretty darn close. So I'll go ahead and get this bumped into position. Okay. Bolt goes through like butter. Washer goes on the back. The original jam nut goes on after that. It will tighten up before you get it spun down tight. And all right, the next step is to torque this to spec. Now this is an unusual bolt in that it gets torqued to 80 Newton meters, which is 59 foot-pounds, and then it gets turned 120 degrees. Now, normally you like to tighten the nut whenever you're setting torque, but since this is a very light, actually pretty light torque, it's not going to be that critical. I'm fine with tightening the bolt to the proper tension, and then it's just a matter of turning the bolt an additional 120 degrees, or the nut, either one. You can do it either way that works out best for you. I'm going to show you the way I do it. It may not work for you, but it's worth a shot. It'll save you a lot of time if you've got the right equipment. So, all right, let me turn this in. And in this case, I'm going to turn the wrench around until it rests on the steering tie rod there. Okay, there's my 60 foot-pounds. Okay, this one gets rotated. It gets torqued to 50 Newton meters, which is about 37 foot-pounds, and then 60 degrees more rotation. So grab your 21, your torque wrench, and set it to 50 Newton meters. Okay, here we go. All right, now we need 60 degrees. So I can eyeball that. Okay, I'm going to just eyeball 60 degrees here, which is about that much. And that ought to hold it. And I'm going to do the same for this one. All right, done. We're now ready to torque down the main chassis bolt, the bushing end here, of the new control arm, but not quite ready. What we need to do is we need to raise the suspension to ride height, because as you saw with the other control arm, it is resting at what is road height, which means it's not under any stress at that point, and any diversion up and down, it twists the rubber, but that's how it's supposed to work. If you bolt it down solid in this position and then put weight on the car, the rubber bushing is twisted violently its entire life. It will not last very long. It won't ride correctly. It'll do a lot of things wrong. So the trick is just get the car to ride height, get the suspension to ride height, which I'm going to do with a floor jack on the rotor here, carefully in the center. I'll just raise it up until it just starts to unweight the floor jack stand over there, and at that point I know it's supporting its normal amount of weight, and I can go ahead and tighten down that control arm. So let's get started on that. Okay, the weight just came off the jack stand, so we're now at ride height. It's supported safely and accurately at that point, and it's just a matter of torquing that bolt down to 80 Newton meters, which corresponds to 59 foot-pounds with a torque wrench. And again, I'm going to torque it from the bolt side because it's a relatively low torque setting, so it's not really a lot different than doing it on the nut side. After that, I have to rotate it 120 degrees, and I'll show you the easy cheat I've come up with to do that. Okay, I'm going to get on the nut. Okay, that's on it. I've got it so that it's going to come around and contact this tie rod to keep the nut from turning. Alright, so there we go. We've got contact. And I'll just snug this down till the torque wrench tells me I am at 59 foot-pounds. Okay, we're there. Now, the next trick is I have to do 120 degrees more than that. So, how do I go about doing that? Well, I could eyeball it. That's generally fine, but for turning it that far, I'd rather be a little more accurate. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a pen, and I'm going to mark a little timing mark down here and make that my target. So I want to go 120 degrees up here and make another mark. Now, basically, thinking back to my junior high geometry, I'll know that this point right here, straight up, that's 180 degrees. Okay, there's my 0 degree mark, and there's my 180 degree mark. So to dial in what we're looking for, I know at 3 o'clock here will be 90 degrees. That's a quarter of a rotation, that's 90 degrees. I need to go 30 more than that, so the easiest way to do 30 is divide this one into 3 equal sections, and that's kind of there and there. So basically, the one I just drew is my 120 degree point. So what I got to do is just rotate that around to the bottom, and I'm golden. I can do that with a big honking wrench or with my impact. And the nice thing about using an impact is I can just put it on and turn it until it gets there. Or I can use a wrench. There's 90. Okay folks, we're all torqued down. You can see I torqued it to past the 90, or the 90 to the 120 there, 150 would be about there, 180 would be about there, and everything else is ready to go except for the axle bolts, which I have to torque down after I get them on the ground to a really high torque level. So I will do that. You don't really need to watch. You can figure that out, and you won't have to do it if you don't buy the Lemforder control arms anyway, if you get some that actually fit without having to take half your car apart. So I would recommend doing that.
And here you can see the difference between the Lemforder upper control arm and the Mercedes style. In this case I used a Vaco part which resembles the Mercedes OEM original unit, and you can see how the edge of the housing around the ball joint housing is what's causing all the problems. If it didn't have that extra little edge sticking out, it would have been a 10-15 minute per side remove and swap. As it is, it requires pulling the axle, disconnecting the hub. It's just a major hassle. So again, if you have a 4Matic, I would strongly suggest you go with something other than the Lemforder part.